Domestic violence and firearms. Me and my gun videos are still my best performing videos, so I figured I'd explain how domestic violence affects your gun laws and stay to the end for a little extra about cops and domestic violence. We're going to go over Title 18 of the United States Code, Section 922, subsection G, subsection 9, or I'm sure I'm going to mess this up, the Lutenberg Amendment in the fall of 1996. The provisions amends the Federal Gun Control Act of 1968 by banning the possession of firearms by individuals convicted of a misdemeanor crime of domestic violence, which means it's also called the gun ban for individuals convicted of a misdemeanor crime of domestic violence. The 1968 Gun Control Act amendments, codified at 18 United States Code 921, prohibited anyone convicted of a felony and anyone subject to a domestic violence protective order from possessing a firearm. The intended effect of the new legislation is to extend the firearms ban to anyone convicted of a misdemeanor crime of domestic violence. The old one was for any felony and if you was under a protection order of a domestic violence. The new amendment changes it from the protection order to any misdemeanor crime of domestic violence. This bill was passed with almost unanimous support and represents the Congress' recognition that anyone who attempts or threatens violence against a loved one has demonstrated that he or she poses a unacceptable risk and should be prohibited from possessing firearms. Congressional Record PS 11-878 on September 30th, 1996. The new provision affects law enforcement in three interrelated ways. First, it will assist in preventing those individuals who have demonstrated a likelihood of domestic violence from obtaining a firearm. Second, it will assist law enforcement by providing a tool for the removal of firearms from certain explosive domestic situations, thus decreasing the possibility of deadly force. Finally, it will serve as a federal prosecution tool in certain situations where alternatives have failed. Qualifying offense. As enacted as the statute defines misdemeanor crime of domestic violence as any state or federal misdemeanor that has an element the use or attempted use of physical force or the threatened use of a deadly weapon committed by a current or former spouse, parent, or guardian of the victim, by a person with whom the victim shares a child in common, by a person who is cohabiting with or has cohabited with the victim as a spouse, parent, or guardian, or by a person similarly situated to a spouse, parent, or guardian of the victim. This definition includes all misdemeanors that involve the use or attempted use of physical force, simple assault, and battery, if the offense is committed by one of defined parties. This is true whether or not the statute specifically defines the offense as a domestic violence misdemeanor. For example, a person convicted of a misdemeanor assault against his or her spouse would be prohibited from receiving or possessing firearms. It is anticipated that this issue will be subject to litigation. In the event of such litigation, the terrorism and violent crime section should be notified so that the assistance can be provided. Date of previous conviction. The prohibition applies to persons convicted of such misdemeanors at any time, even if the conviction occurred prior to the law's effective date, September 30th, 1996. See United States versus Brady and United States versus Waters. What they're saying there is, even though this came out September 30th, 1996, when it was officially made into the law, if you was convicted of a domestic before then, you cannot own a firearm after that date. Some laws will put it into effect to where if something happened before it was actually enacted, then those don't count. But in this situation, they're saying it doesn't matter, that those previous convictions do count and you cannot own a firearm. Limitations on previous conviction. To qualify, 1. At the time of the previous conviction, the defendant must have been represented by counsel or knowingly and intelligently waive the right to counsel. 2. If the offense of previous conviction entitled the person to a jury trial in the jurisdiction in which the case was tried, either the case was tried by a jury or the person knowingly and intelligently waived the right to have the case tried by a jury by guilty plea or otherwise. And 3. The conviction cannot have been expunged or set aside or by any offense for which the person has been pardoned or has had civil rights restored, if the law of the jurisdiction provides for the loss of the civil rights under such an offense, unless the pardon, expungement, or restoration of civil rights expressly provides that the person may not ship, transport, possess, or receive firearm. The issue of restoration of civil rights must be carefully researched for each potential defendant. For example, in some states, a person automatically loses his or her civil rights upon the execution of a sentence of imprisonment, felony, or misdemeanor, only to have the rights restored upon the defendant's release from prison or sentenced. However, in those states, a person who does not serve a sentence of imprisonment may not lose their civil rights and thereof, and therefore the limitations may not be acceptable. But in the United States versus I'll put the name here because I'm not finished to butcher that up on camera. The court held that at least some instances in one group of felons may possess a firearm because their rights were automatically taken away and then restored. And those who do not have their rights taken away may also possess a firearm. The terrorism and violent crime section can provide an assistance in analyzing particular cases. This section here is going to be crucial to the later part of this video. You'll see why as you continue to watch. There is no law enforcement exception. On the provisions of this new statute, remove the exemption that 18 United States 925 subsection A1 provided to police and military. Thus, as of the effective date, any member of the military, any police officer who has a qualifying misdemeanor conviction is no longer able to possess a firearm, even while on duty. Meaning that if you get a domestic at any time in your life, you are no longer allowed to work in law enforcement or in the military if you have to possess a gun. If you work a desk job with no gun required, then you probably still can, but I seriously doubt an agency will hire you with a domestic violence on your record. We now have the situation that 18 U.S.C. 925A1 still exempts felony convictions for those two groups. Thus, if a police officer is convicted of murdering his or her spouse or as a protection order placed against them, they may, under federal law, still be able to possess a service revolver while on duty. Whereas, if they are convicted of a qualifying misdemeanor, they are prohibited from possessing any firearm or ammunition at any time. Currently pending before Congress are at least two bills that would substantially modify the impact of the amendment to this section. Prosecution's consideration. In determining whether a particular case merits federal prosecution, you should consider the following factors: the date of the previous conviction, under what circumstances the firearm was obtained, whether there are indications of current potential for violence. Example, recent incidents of domestic violence would be a stronger argument for prosecution than if a number of years had passed since any domestic problems had occurred. Alternatives available to federal prosecution, state prosecution, voluntary removal of the weapons, whether the potential defendant was on notice that his or her possession of a firearm was illegal, whether the potential defendant had made any false statements in obtaining the firearm. False statements would be when you buy a firearm, you'll have to list on there, it'll ask you questions pertaining to whether you're allowed to own a firearm or not. If I'm not mistaken, I think one of them is a domestic violence question. Even if a determination is made that prosecution is not warranted, steps should be taken to assure that the firearm is removed from the possession of the prohibited individual. Depending upon the situation, this might be done by having a local, state, federal law enforcement officer notify the individual of the application of the new law and offer to take temporary custody of the firearm. In other, more volatile situations, it may be necessary to obtain a search warrant and seizure warrant to assure that the firearm is removed immediately. ATF has primary investigative responsibilities over this section. However, in many locales, ATF agents may not be immediately available. The department will be working with other federal agencies to determine whether if any other investigative alternatives are available. In the meantime, United States Attorney's officers should be working with state and local law enforcement to establish guidelines for handling those cases, which will often arise in emergency situations, such as when a local officer responds to a domestic complaint and learns that a firearm is present and that one of the parties is prohibited under this statute. Now comes the loophole in the law. It is a federal crime, not a state crime, which means if you're convicted of a domestic violence and later on found with a gun, we are not allowed to let you have that gun, but we also have no law to charge you. So what ends up happening is we take the gun from you, notify the ATF, which they're the ones responsible for prosecution, and if they decline to go on further with it, we can't give you the gun back because you're not allowed to own the gun or under this current federal law, which means we can't give you the gun back. Being that they failed to prosecute the gun, it's not necessarily done in a crime. They don't take possession of it. We can't give it back to you, so it sits in this roundabout loophole to where we can't give it to you, we can't destroy it, and we can't sell it. So it sits and takes up room that a lot of agencies don't have. On to the cops and domestic violence that I told you about in the beginning. Here we go. While I was doing this research for this video and coming up with all the information, I came across a news article from Salt Lake City news agency KUTV. I think it was channel 2 there or something. They are quoting a study that claims that 40% of police officer families experience domestic violence. They listed an article for reference, but this article was no longer accessible. When I clicked on the article, it would go to a dead page or a page that was unavailable, but I didn't stop looking there, so I eventually found the articles, which I will talk about after this news article. KUTV News did some digging of their own and found it comes when Two studies were done in the early 1990s, which were highlighted by the National Center for Women in Policing. I'll talk about them in a second also. The dates are wrong on that. One study was done in the early 80s, but was published later in the early 90s. And one of the studies were done and published shortly after, and also in the early 90s. The reason why I say that is because in the world of law enforcement, year to year things change drastically. Study done in law enforcement in the 80s will not hold up in the 90s and so on and so forth. It just changes rapidly because as an issue arises, the first people that it hits is the ones in the next academy class. They get hit with those changes. They're taught in those classes that this is an issue. Don't be that person. And I say that because in the two academies that I went through, domestic violence in law enforcement was an actual topic there. And they've got more domestic violence training in those classes, not necessarily for us dealing with the public, but there's also a reflection on law enforcement and domestic violence. And another issue with that is a lot of this stems from new studies done on the mental health of law enforcement. I'm not saying there's an excuse there, but they were seeing a trend with cops constantly being in traumatic situations and domestic violence rates. I don't have the study on it. This is just going off of memory of what our classes were on. So as the domestic violence become an issue, then the mental health become an issue. I would be willing to bet that the numbers are way down because of the advancements and the mental health and domestic violence laws. All right, KUTV quoted, 2 studies have found that at least 40% of police officers' families experience domestic violence in contrast to 10% of families in the general population. The National Center for Women in Policing says a third study of older and more experienced officers found a rate of 24%, indicating domestic violence is 2 to 4 times more common among police families than American families in general. The study says that the numbers of concerning consideration spouses and children of police officers have unique vulnerability. That's because of 3 things. The study says the officer who is abusing them has a gun. The officer who is abusing them knows the location of battered women's shelters. The officer who is abusing them knows how to manipulate the system to avoid penalty and or shift blame to the victim. All right, what I find strange about this is that they are listing children, but the study that they are getting the information from listed the question as, in the last 6 months, have you gotten out of control and acted violently towards your children and spouse? I really wish the question was more direct and separated out, as in asking about the spouse and child separately and defining what actually gotten out of control and violently towards. To me, that's a lot of questions rolled into one. They should have simplified it out. But like I said, this test was from the early 80s, so questionnaires probably wasn't the best then. Still, not saying it's okay to abuse somebody, but I'm just saying for better research purposes and numbers, I wish things were done a little bit different. My thoughts on that little bit was officers do have a gun, but so does a lot of people, including people who are being abused. Still doesn't make it okay. Just saying that they're listing that as one of the factors. That is where the new law comes in and plays in another step to helping to protect the victim, like the ones we just went over. Once they're in a situation of domestic violence, they can no longer have that gun, and they can no longer work in law enforcement. Which brings me to what I said then about if you're being charged with domestic violence or you're going through this, a lot of times your agencies will not let you work or even fire you, and you will not be working in law enforcement until it's over with, until they figure out exactly what's going on. Even at that point, once that's on your record that you was charged with it, it's still going to be hard to find a job in law enforcement for obvious reasons. But stating that officers know where the shelters are is flat out wrong. Here in Mississippi, they take steps and keep us from knowing. This goes back to where I said I've taken several domestic violence classes in and out of the academy. In one of my classes, we had a director of a large domestic violence shelter that operates in the state. Purposely left their name out for a reason, but the steps they take are using a hotline, then coordinating with multiple pickups and drop-offs. So one person is tasked with coming and getting them, dropping them off somebody else, then so on and so forth. They swap through several different transitions. In that situation, they did not disclose how many pickup and drop-offs there were, how many times they did it, how long they stayed at each location. None of that was discussed for obvious reasons. All right, they provided all new clothing and supplies. It means when it was time to go, whatever you had, if you had time to pack, then great. If not, they didn't want you to have to worry about it. So that was another issue. Once you got there, you got clothes, all the essentials you needed, then they would help you get more. And they would set them up in different locations. And if there was a chance that they would be recognized anywhere in the area that they were at, they would move them to different towns, away from anyone that might recognize them or know them. And if need be, they set them up with a new identification. Highly unlikely, but sometimes that does take place, they will help them. And once you call that hotline, you're issued a caseworker, and that caseworker is with you from start to finish. Even if you have to go to the hospital and you're not completely ready to leave, if you call that number, they will give you a caseworker. That caseworker will come and talk with you at the hospital and discuss options with you, and will be with you throughout the whole time if that's what you want. Then this is where it comes to being wrong about us knowing where the shelters are. They purposely do not allow us to drop you off anywhere. If we have you, they come and pick you up. We do not know where these shelters, we know where their office is, but you never go there in a domestic situation. When it comes to the shelters, they are hidden. They're hidden in plain sight. You will drive past them all day and every day, and you will not know what they are. They said some look like homes, some look like businesses, and I've never seen one. I couldn't tell you what the actual shelter looks like. And that is done by design and on purpose. Keeps people from knowing, keeps your abuser from finding you, and it keeps them from following us to find out where you're at, because we never know. We never go there. Officers know how to manipulate the system in a way that could be right. We are taught what to do, what to look for, stuff of that nature. A lot of times there's a lot of emotion there. They will not be able to completely manipulate the system, because the way the system is set up, you separate everyone. Then you find out exactly what's going on from both sides. If you're an officer and you go to a domestic situation with another officer, at that point in time, that person is not an officer. They are a member of the public. Treat them the same as you would the person next door to them. It's the only way you can protect him or her, whichever one the officer is, and their spouse. Your job at that point is not to be that person's friend. It's to be the officer on scene and handle that situation. If they get mad at you for that, that's on them. They should be able to understand and separate it themselves. But like I said, if it's done correctly, if you do it the way that you were taught, it won't take long to see through any type of manipulation that they're trying to pull, because they don't know what's being said on the other side, and they will try to get ahead of it. The more time you spend investigating that situation, the more time you'll see what actually happened. The scene will tell you just as much as the words coming out of their mouth. And I'm not going to sit here and overlook the proverbial elephant in the room situation. I'm sure some cases do get thrown out or overlooked or not looked into, or whatever the case may be at that time. I'm not one to sit here and just, oh no, it never happens. I'm sure it does. There's really nothing more to say. I'm sure it happens. It shouldn't happen. We're all in agreement to that. What's good for one is good for all. In the cases where it does get overlooked at the beginning, it won't stay that way long, because the research shows that domestic violence very rarely stops, and it always intensifies with each situation. You'll have your blow up stage. It'll go back around to what they call the honeymoon stage, where everything's perfectly great. Then that one little set off, then you're back into a domestic situation. Each time you get into that rotation, that stage where things get violent, normally intensifies. Then there's going to come a time that something's going to happen that they can't overlook. I'm not saying that necessarily it's going to be the worst situation in the world, but it possibly could be. And if you're in this situation where sometimes things get overlooked, as a victim in the situation, call the domestic hotline shelter. Get out of the situation. I know that's easy to say, but hard to do. There's always going to be a lot of emotion, a lot of feelings, but just know from the research that this is a situation that is probably going to get worse, and more than likely going to get more violent with each incident or situation that you're involved in. When it comes to that, document every time you call. If you feel like the situation is being overlooked and being passed upon, you have the right to ask for a report. You have a right to go and get a copy of your report. If you do not feel safe bringing it home, find someone, a family member or somebody that will hold that report for you. Because at the end of this, if something does get worse and it could have been stopped at any point in time, you'll have all the paperwork on the people who could have been held liable. Once that starts happening, people understand that they're going to be held liable for something later. They're more than likely going to do their job. Shouldn't come to that, but I'm giving you instances where you can help save and protect yourself. And if you ever do call a domestic situation, that is your time to be honest, be upfront, don't lie at any point in there. KUTV then quotes another study called Fox in the Hen House. It's a more recent study. The study was done in 2013, but noted the lack of data surrounding police officer and domestic violence. The study contained 324 cases of domestic violence involving officers. It found that 281 officers from 226 law enforcement agencies were arrested for domestic violence. Some of these officers had multiple criminal cases and are multiple victims. There were 70 officer-involved domestic violence cases during 2005 116 cases in 2006, 138 cases in 2007. The percentage of total police crimes that were officer-involved domestic violence crimes remained relatively stable from 2005 at 17.2% to 2007 at 16%. Of all the cases, police officers who were arrested, charged, and convicted of abuse, more than half kept their jobs. The study done by the National Center of Women Policing says domestic violence cases are underreported. Not sure where they got their numbers from. I looked over the study they are quoting, did not see the numbers they are posting. Not saying they are wrong, but I did not see them in the study, like exactly laid out the way they're quoting. They are quoting the National Center for Women in Policing, but I did not see them listed as being involved in the study. Being that study is actually still able to find, the links are still good to it, and I can see the whole study. I'm not sure how they keep their job, being that they can no longer have a gun, even if it's work related. So if they claim that over half of them kept their jobs, I'm just curious as to how and what they're currently doing at their agencies. And that brings me to think that maybe that they're wrapping up correctional officers with police officers. Not sure. The main part of being a police officer is you have to tote a gun. I've never seen an agency with a policy that says you can work the streets without a gun. Too big of a liability. So that I'm curious about that. Didn't see it in there. And as far as crimes being underreported, no matter what study you see or what group's pushing that study or who's behind trying to disclose this wonderful information they have found, they will always say that the crimes are unreported, which they probably are. I don't care what the crimes are. You can't catch them all. Not everybody reports. Victims often fear calling the police because they know the case will be handled by officers who are colleagues and are their friends of their abusers. Victims of police family violence typically fear that the responding officers will side with their abuser and fail to properly investigate or document the crime. Like I said earlier, not saying it don't happen, I'm sure it does, but it should. I'm against it because you're, at the end of the day, that might be your friend, you might be a colleague, you might work with them, you may work for the same agency. That should not change how you handle the case. Work it as if that was your daughter or your son that was being abused. Simple. The National Center for Women in Policing, many police agencies often handle these cases informally, often without an official report, investigation, or even a check on the victim's safety. A 1994 nationwide survey of police departments done by the Arlington, Texas Police Department and the Southwestern Law Enforcement Institute found that 45% had no specific policy for dealing with the domestic violence involving an officer. Shouldn't have to. It's against federal law for them to have a gun, and their policy should be no different than the law. If they committed domestic violence, they should be charged. Once they're charged and convicted, like any other person, they are no longer to have a gun, so therefore they no longer have a job, and there shouldn't even be a concern of policy if everything else was done correctly. The system works. You just have to work the system. I don't see where that would be an issue. Committed domestic violence, get charged, go to court, get convicted, can no longer have a gun, can't work without a gun, you lose your job. Why is there has to be a separate policy? Don't understand that, but we'll continue. Other findings from the study, according to the National Center for Women in Policing, include the most common discipline imposed on a sustained allegation of domestic violence was counseling. Only 19% of the departments indicated that officers would be terminated after a second sustained allegation of domestic violence. I'm just curious as what they're calling domestic violence here. It could be an allegation of domestic violence if you argue with your wife. Yes. Just a plain argument that you can't handle and you call us, that is an allegation of domestic violence. So I'm curious if they're meaning that or something more severe. That's why I hate these studies that don't clarify exactly what they're saying or calling as a domestic violence situation. Every couple that has ever been on this earth is going to argue in their own way about their own situations. But as far as this case study goes about police keeping their job and receiving only counseling. If you're arguing with your spouse, counseling could be anything from, here in Mississippi we have a system called LEAPS where they will actually counsel law enforcement families. If the family needs help and they're seeking help, LEAPS can help them. That's a whole nother video, but LEAPS is a support system for law enforcement and families that are struggling with issues dealing with them and their jobs or their family, and it's to help keep things like this down. It's one of the reasons is to keep suicides down. It keep you from leaving your job to find relief. It keeps you from using alcohol or any other substance, because that does happen. Some people just sometimes can't handle the situation. It's a wonderful thing. If you need help, you're in law enforcement in Mississippi or a law enforcement family, and somebody you know that's in law enforcement, your spouse or family member that does need help, you can reach out to LEAPS. They will contact them and sit down and talk with them and find out other situations. But back to this. Yes, counseling could be something that is needed. It could be marriage counseling, could be anger counseling for the person, whichever officer it is. Counseling is not always a bad thing. It's a good thing in a situation of this, but trying to use it against them, saying that, oh, nothing happened but counseling. Sometimes that's all that's needed. Like I said, I wish these things were more laid out, more defined, so you could be looked into further, but we're moving on. KUTV quoted the National Center of Women in Policing a lot. So I tried to look into them, and it's no longer active. The National Center of Women in Policing website was active from 2001 to 2013, which is why I know they weren't a part of the 1990 studies. They could have been, but I doubt they were active before then. And The Fox in the Hen House was published in 2013, so chances of them being involved in it were really slim. Didn't see their name or nothing in it. The information I found on the National Center of Women in Policing came from a women's knowledge and digital library. I say that to say they listed the publisher of the site as a feminist majority foundation's National Center for Women in Policing, and described the purpose as increasing the numbers of women at all ranks of law enforcement as a strategy to improve police response to violence against women, to reduce police brutality and excessive force, and to strengthen community policing reforms. The wording of those just don't sit right with me. Don't get me wrong, I have nothing wrong with women in law enforcement or any other job. Nothing. I'm into the equal rights. Equal work should 100% equal pay. If they can do the same job, they should deserve the same pay. But when you word it into the world of law enforcement as that you're a feminist majority foundation, that your whole goal is to get women into ranks of different agencies. It's not to have women to do the job or better do the job. You just want to force them into these ranks. If a woman can do the job, she will rank just like anybody else. I see it all the time. Once they do that job, they do it proficiently and well, they will rank. Shouldn't be a foundation for this, but there is, or was. Still not a problem with it, but you're using it as a strategy to improve police response to violent crimes against women. Why not improve the police response to violent crimes against everybody? Why does it necessarily have to be just for women? If they really love this job, they don't care if it's man, woman, child. They don't care the race, the sex, how they identify. Their job is to help the people when the people need help. For you to clarify that it's just to help violence against women just doesn't sit right with me. To reduce police brutality and excessive force. There is a very minute number of officers that get into police brutality or excessive force. I just don't see how putting women in those roles is going to change that. When you have a strong structure of anybody that's in a rank, they can stop that if they're allowed to do so. When I say that, you have police unions, you have the civil service. It makes it really hard to fire somebody when they need to be fired. But also lets the officer know that it takes a lot to be fired. They have their ups and downs either way, but I don't care if it's a man or a woman. If they're allowed to do their job correctly and they work their way through the ranks, they can see these issues sometimes before they happen. Sometimes, they happen. It wasn't meant to happen, but they happen. I'm not making any excuses for them, but I'm just saying in the form of a feminist group pushing women in there to stop these. This job is built on the rank system, which comes with a lot of respect. If you force somebody or promote somebody that really wasn't or shouldn't have earned it in the way of working the streets, they're not going to stop this. There's going to be a lot of resentment and a lot of morale issues. And to strengthen community policing reforms. Community policing is a great thing. I always tell everybody that this is your community. I'm just here to help you clean it up. If you don't want help cleaning up your own community, we have no help from the community. It's hard for us to do our jobs and to clean up your community. At the end of the day, you live there. I don't. I'm just there to help you. And a lot of people don't understand that. But without the help of the community, they have a slight form of protection. I know it sounds crazy to believe or when you hear it in that aspect, but it's true. If you see something and don't say something, you're allowing it to happen. You don't have to be in the middle of it, but if we don't get information from the community itself, it's hard for us to stay there and get people that need to be got. That's the simplest way to put it. But moving on. When it comes to women in law enforcement, like I said, I'm not against it. I'm here for it. Let's do it. If they can do the job, give it to them. If they can do the same job, pay them the same, which they are because it's government work. There's no differentiation between this. You got this years, you get this. You've done this, you get this. It's all laid out. There's no way to really cheat that system like a lot of people think. But when it comes to being equal, I had this discussion while I was in one of my academies with a female that got extremely mad, saying that she wasn't paid the same as a male officer, which is not true because there's a pay scale that's laid out. You're in a government run position, you can see what somebody makes. If you have an issue with it, you need to find out why. It could be simply that they have more college credits than you, but it's all done on a system to where it cannot be cheated. But what really got her upset was I asked her the question, do you believe in equal pay for the equal job? She said yes. My discussion was, if everything was equal, then why do we have two different PT tests for men and women? The man's test is a lot harder than a woman's test. Everything's different. If we do the same job for the same pay and you're required to do the same thing that I do on a daily basis, how come I'm required to work a lot harder to get the job? Like I said, even regardless after that, she does the same job every day, she gets the same pay. I don't care about that. But if everything is to be equal, why is there two different PT tests? And if y'all want me to talk about it and actually go over the Board of Minimum Standards requirements for Law Enforcement Mississippi, the PT test, let me know. I will go over it. But it's drastically different. You might actually be shocked how much easier it actually is. So we're going to move on from that. All right, back to the topic of the video and the news articles. Most of the reference links to the quoted studies were not any good, but I found another article written by Joshua Klugman. I'm sure I mispronounced that, but I'll put it right here for you to read. He is this associate professor in sociology and psychology of the Temple University. He published a study on July 20th, 2020, and he linked certain pages of the articles because he went over them himself. That's how I found out that the first study that they were going over was the testimony of Lennar Bullen Johnson, who was at the time a professor in the Department of Family Studies at the Arizona State University. Johnson explained the surveyed 728 officers and 479 police spouses, which is kind of where I think some of the numbers are screwed up, because you got 728 officers but only 479 police spouses. They did it in 2 East Coast police departments, moderate to large size. They say the sample was drawn in 1983. And he goes on to explain how, this is his words from his article, that there was no information on response rates or how officers were selected or how they were invited to participate. It says the 40% figure was mentioned on page 42. Percent of the spouses reported being physically abused by their mates at least once. The same percentage claimed that their children were physically abused. The officers were asked a less direct question. This is where I got that question earlier. If you had ever gotten out of control and behaved violently against their spouse and children in the last 6 months. It says we did not define the type of violence. Thus, violence could have been interpreted as verbal or physical threats or actual physical abuse. Approximately 40% said that in the last 6 months prior to the survey, they had behaved violently towards their spouse or children. Well, I said the question should have been more defined and singled out instead of putting everything into one broad question. Given that 20-30% of the spouses claimed that their mate frequently became verbally abusive toward them or their children, I suspect that a significant number of police officers define violence as both verbal and physical. Like I said, that's coming from Professor Klugman. But the second survey that was done, I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce it. I'll put it on the screen. The study reveals that a survey of self-reports of police officers. They surveyed 385 male officers and 40 female officers and 115 female spouses who were apparently attending in-service training sessions and law enforcement conferences. If they had 40 female officers, I want to know why they didn't ask the male spouses. Kind of seems a little odd to me. Wish the numbers of female and male officers were the same along with the female and male spouses. Kind of would like to see an equal pool of participants. All right, to measure domestic violence, they use the modified conflict tactics scales, which gives subjects a list of 25 conflict behaviors and ask them to report the number of times they had engaged in each of them during the past year on a 7-point scale ranging from never to more than 20 times a year. Although their analysts, they collapse this into never versus ever, then give examples of items consisting minor and severe violence. They describe minor violence as thrown something at your spouse, pushed, grabbed, or shoved your spouse, slapped your spouse, kicked, bit, or hit with a fist. Severe violence: choked or strangled your spouse, beat up your spouse, threatened spouse with a knife or gun, used a knife or gun on your spouse. Table 2, male officers. The minor violence was 25%. The self-reported, and they self-reported 3%, and any was 28%, which total of 28%. The spouse reported minor as 27, severe as 6, and 33 altogether. A normal relationship is what I'm assuming they're putting here. 33% was minor, severe was 8%, and any is 41%. Our relationship, I'm not sure exactly how they define the relationship because they do ask the spouses also. I'm not sure if this is outside relationships or ones where they were not married and they were just in a relationship. But it doesn't say how they got it because they said they only asked male officers, female officers, and the female spouses. Like I said, in relationships, it's 33% was minor, 8% was severe, which totaled 41%. The wives of male officers, they self-reported 30% as minor, severe is 3, and 33% together, which makes me wonder how they got from the male officers where it says spouse. If they asked the spouse there, then ask the spouse again, the numbers I think would be the same. Who knows? Same way with the spouse reporting it, you would think that would be the male officers. In that same situation, you would figure the numbers would be the same. I understand that the spouse, the female wives, were only 115 versus the 385 male officers. So that might be the difference that we see here is from the ones who are actually married and the ones who aren't, or who the ones that actually showed up for the study. But you would think the numbers are closely the same, which they are, in the fact of the male officer spouse equaled 33%, then they self-reported 33%. So the numbers are really close there. As you see here, they go on, do the same thing with the spouses, which I said should be close to the same, which is 3% difference. So that's close enough for margin of error, I believe. Female officers were self-reported 27%, which is higher than the males, 25% under minor. And they're saying that it's 0% for severe, which totaled up 27% altogether, which is only 1% away from the males' 28% average. And I'm curious as they got the female officer spouse reporting, but unless they're saying the spouse abused them, which could be the possibility, but still doesn't explain how the relationship part come in. Like I said, I don't have access to the full studies because he didn't quote the full studies or post the full studies. He only posted a few pages of it. He goes on to say that he did this study because he thought the numbers were going to be statistically wrong, but as he stated in there, he found out that the 1990 studies were really close in similarity. Like I said, I don't have full access to these. I'm just reporting what he says. I will try to link as much of the stuff as I can to the bottom. If you want to see everything, I'll try to link all 3 studies. And if you like this video, let me know in the comments so I can make more videos of this in this nature. We'll focus it more on the Mississippi side of things, being that is what my channel is geared towards, to helping people out of Mississippi and to better understand the Mississippi law enforcement in any aspect, which this is the ugly side of it, is domestic violence. It happens. If you like this type of content, please comment. Let me know that you want more or what you want to see next. I try to do my longer videos on Monday, which I'm hoping this is out on Monday, and my shorter videos on Fridays. Like I said, thank you for watching. Have a great day.